Does the Big Bang Theory point us to God? When scientists explore and discover the world of particle physics, does that lend credibility to not only God's existence, but even the Christian God? What would scientists on either side of the faith aisle agree or disagree on when it comes to the cosmological argument? What issues do atheists take with this line of reasoning, and how might Christians respond? We're going to be talking about all of that and more on today's episode of Theology on Air. Well, welcome back to Theology on Air. I am Sarah Stone. I'm the Outreach Director for Young Adults at Memorial Drive Presbyterian Church here in Houston. Joined by two guests, but we'll get to that in a second. I'm joined by Evan McClanahan, my co-producer, who is the senior pastor here at First Lutheran in Midtown. And as many of you know, Theology on Air was born out of the ministry Theology on Tap, where we get together every other month with young adults in Houston and we discuss really interesting topics over craft beer, things like theology and philosophy and faith and culture. And then, of course, in the podcast, we get to dive deeper into some of those ideas and haggle them and wrestle with them. And so that's what we're doing today. If you enjoy this kind of thing, as usual, please subscribe, rate us, review us, tell your friends so that we can grow and keep doing this kind of thing. I am going to actually let Brian introduce himself in a few minutes because we're doing something a little bit different today. We've invited Dr. Mike Strauss to come on the show. And then I'm going to let these two kind of dialogue a little bit about some of these ideas. But Dr. Strauss is an experimental particle physicist, professor of physics at the University of Oklahoma, and conducts research at CERN, the world's premier particle physics laboratory, where he studies the fundamental particles and forces in the universe. He's currently studying properties of the Higgs boson. Am I saying that right? I hope so. That was discovered in 2012. He's done previous research at the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center and at the Fermi National Laboratory. I used to live up there. Yeah. And Mike is the author of The Creator Revealed. A physicist examines the Big Bang and the Bible. And he's one of the general editors of Zondervan's Dictionary of Christianity and Science. And that is the bio that I winnowed down. He's cool. He does really cool things. But we'll get to hear from him directly here. And then we'll get to hear Brian's thoughts as our friendly atheist. Many of you have heard Brian before on our podcast, but I'm getting ahead of myself. To start us off, Mike, can I call you Mike? I guess please on air now you have to say yes.
No, please call me Mike. I only make my wife call me Dr. Strauss. So,
oh my gosh, that sounds like a problem. Okay.
No, she's not watching. She's at work, so we're good.
For now. Yeah. I've already Facebook messaged her. No. Start by just telling us a little bit about you and your story. Before we get into all of the particle physics, tell us just a little bit about your faith story, how you came to faith, and then, maybe take us into what got you interested in science.
Right. Well, thanks for inviting me. I'd much rather be there with a craft beer in my hand, but I guess
we're drinking water in the studio, but if you ever make it down here, for sure.
So I actually grew up in a family. My dad was a pastor, and my elementary years were spent in Huntsville, Alabama during the time of the space race. So at that time, many young kids were just fascinated by this race to the moon. And if you talk to many scientists today, they'll tell you that's what got them interested in science. So that's kind of what got me interested in science, was just watching the tremendous achievements of humans in space. As far as my faith journey, again, I grew up in a family where my dad was a pastor. He was very influential in that he wasn't a hypocrite. The things he would preach on Sunday, you watched him live his life on Monday through Saturday, and that had a big impact. I was always a thinking person. I became a Christian quite young, but like the story of many people who become a Christian when they're children, that there comes a point where you have to make this childhood faith of your parents somehow your own. And for me, that was a process that probably started in high school and continued through college and even some of graduate school. And it was much an intellectual process. Many of the things that the stories you're kind of told as a child, you don't hold on to. I don't believe in Santa Claus anymore. I know that's a shock to many people.
Now we have to mark this unsafe for children.
Right, unsafe for children. I still do believe that you shouldn't touch a hot stove. And so why do I take one thing from my childhood upbringing and not the other? Because I think there's evidence for it. And so there's evidence to not touch a hot stove. I I think there's less evidence for Santa Claus. But nevertheless, so it was a process for me as I became an adult to always also make my faith something that I could hold on to as an adult.
Yeah. No, I love that. And then, so the space race is what kind of got you interested in science. So you went to college and said, I want to go to space? Just kidding. I want to look at quarks.
Yeah,
I mean, how does that?
I had no role models for what scientist was. And I had a great chemistry teacher in high school. So I knew I liked science. I actually went to a college where I could study theology and science, because at that time I still didn't know what I wanted to do.
Is that Biola? Is that where you
went?
Yeah,
Biola University in La Mirada, California. My family still lives in California, my mom. And I found I really like physics. It's a fundamental science coming out of college then. So the general interest in science and technology in college focused on physics. I still didn't know what area of physics, and to be honest, I still didn't know what a physicist did. I just liked science. So I got accepted for a PhD work at UCLA. If you'd asked me what does a physicist do, I would say I don't know. And here I was, a graduate student in physics. So I eventually learned what a physicist does.
That's good.
Yeah, it is good. And I've come to love the field, and it's fascinating. But it was kind of just following my interests. When students come and ask me, what should I do? Are there jobs in science? Are there jobs in this? My response to them is always, follow your passion and see how far it can take you, and have plan B just in case. And that's kind of what I did.
Yeah. I heard you speak at an apologetics conference a couple of years ago, and the title of your talk was something like along the lines of why the Big Bang Theory is the best apologetic tool in our tool belts, something like that. Explain a little bit about your thoughts about the Big Bang Theory and why you would say Christians should be glad for that. And then we will let Brian talk.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Christians sometimes think that the Big Bang is an atheistic theory that somehow is incompatible with what the Bible teaches about creation. And that's why I often say the Big Bang is a dirty word for many Christians, but the Big Bang is also a dirty word, at least in its original incarnation, for many scientists, because Fred Hoyle coined the term Big Bang, and at that time, its sole meaning, and now actually has multiple meanings, we could talk about that, but its sole meaning was the origin of the universe. And to many scientists, they understand that if the universe had an origin, an actual beginning of space-time, matter, and energy, then it opens up the possibility, at least, of a beginner, of some kind of creator. And there are scientists who really don't like that idea. So there are still, much writing about whether the universe really did have a beginning, and if so, what caused it, if cause is even the right word. But from a theistic point of view, all the evidence we have, or even from a scientific point of view, all the evidence we have points to the universe actually having an origin of of everything, space, time, matter, and energy. And that opens up the door for an originator. And in fact, the New Testament is the only holy book in the world that talks about a God who acts before time began. And everything we know now seems to indicate that time actually had a beginning. But when the Apostle Paul wrote that in the first century, no one knew time had a beginning. So if time had a beginning, if the universe had a beginning, then it looks a lot like a beginner, a creator. And to me, therefore, it's really one of the best evidences for a transcendent cause that looks a lot like the God described in the Bible.
Yeah. So what you're describing there is what some people might call the cosmological argument. And I have heard this said so many times, and I love it. I was telling these guys before we started, and you too, that I'm convinced. And it's one of my favorite kind of apologetic tools for myself. When I doubt, I think, okay, but at least if something came from nothing, something had to cause that. And so there must be something. And then you kind of work backwards from there. And it makes perfect sense. And everything is tied up with a neat bow. And then I go and talk to my skeptical friends, non-believing friends, and they raise all these questions. They say the cosmological argument is not the end all be all. It doesn't actually answer the questions that we are asking, or it's answering a different question. And then they start raising questions that I realize I'm maybe not quite prepared for. And so I decided that maybe we should actually do that on air. Like maybe we should actually experience a little bit of that conversation and kind of just discover where we have common ground, but also where there's some disagreement, or maybe where we're just kind of missing each other, right? Asking different questions from each other, answering different questions than we think. So that is why I invited our friend, Brian Woods. So Brian, let's do this. I'm going to have you just introduce yourself a little bit and then maybe just react to some of your thoughts about the cosmological argument. I know you have plenty because we've talked about it. And then we just want to have a little bit of a dialogue, sort of armchair physicist to physicist, about some of these things and listen like flies on the wall and see what comes of it. How about that?
Sounds good to me.
Okay.
All right. My name's Brian. I think some of you have seen me on here before. I used to be a Christian. I don't think Dr. Strauss or Mike knows this. I used to be a Christian. In my late teens, I would call it heavy into the fundamental side, and came out in my mid-20s on a complete 180 of this. And it really wasn't a scientific term. I didn't even go to school for physics until I was 28. So the turnaround for me was that we don't experience God. So it's a very different issue, very not irrelevant, but a very different issue than I think what we're going to talk about here today. Yeah. But in regards to Mike or Dr. Strauss, I don't really want...
You can call me Mike too, because I'm going to call you Brian. So
Sure.
Yeah.
You guys can call me Your Grace, just to clarify that.
Yes, I do.
You sometimes call me the Grand Poobah of theology. Yeah.
One requirement I talked to Sarah about before doing this, and we just talked to Mike about it, is that I don't want to have a debate. I want to have a conversation, because for one, Mike is a doctor, and I hope to one day be at that level, but he's obviously done his homework and he teaches this stuff. So he's really good. So I more want to act as kind of maybe a bridge and talk to Mike, tell him what I think about what he says, maybe start where we agree, because I think we both agree there is a Big Bang. We can call it that, and we could talk about what that means and what that means to you. But I'm going to want some feedback from Evan and Sarah on what they don't get about what I am not getting. So if there's a step you're seeing that I'm not willing to take, maybe point it out, because that will definitely help this conversation move along.
We're going to turn Brian into a Christian on air today. So y'all comment it. I'm kidding.
No, actually, I love what you said, Brian, because to be honest, there are intellectual challenges to Christianity, but for most people, that's not the biggest issue. And you kind of said that in your story. And I think that's important. I don't think you argue someone intellectual into Christianity. I think there are reasonable answers to reasonable questions, but it's a much bigger step than that, because to be a Christian means, to give your life to somebody else. That's a big thing. Mm-hmm. And if you don't even believe that somebody else exists, then it's even a bigger thing, right?
Sure. Well, maybe I can start off by saying where I've gone in physics. Probably the farthest I went was in a relativity class where we used Sean Carroll's textbook. And with cosmology, I think the most I ever did, and I'm going to have to recall this, so forgive me, I'm going to really get this wrong, but we calculated we derived an integral that we used to calculate the age of the universe. So, and it uses energy densities and things like that. And we can set that, one of the limits on the integral to 0 and go from there. To me, that seems like we're counting down to 0, right? And there are other issues to take into account, right? Like that maybe quantum mechanics and relativity don't mesh together. And so it seems more like we can count down, but we're really maybe not getting to that moment experimentally, because when we look at the data, we're not getting to that 0. I don't know what your thoughts are.
No, it's a great objection. The objection, as I would phrase it, is that we have no theoretical calculations or experimental evidence that takes us beyond 10 to the minus 12 seconds or 10 to the minus 30th seconds, depending on where you want to draw the line. And so there is a period that's at least 10 to the minus 34 seconds of total unknown, of total speculation. So when I want to, try to rebut that, what I'll say is, and I'd love to hear your thought on this, is everything we know from 10 to the minus 12 seconds to now, and even the theoretical things we do know, you've probably heard of the BGV theorem, for instance.
Oh, who hasn't? Am I right?
Right. So, well, Brian's shaking his head yes. So
Evan and I are just going to have a little party over here on our own. No.
We'll talk about what that is. It's really interesting, and it's easily explainable. But everything we do know says the universe had a beginning. We don't know what happened in the first 10 minus 30 seconds. So if you want to say it didn't have a beginning, or if it had a natural cause, you can, what I would argue, and I'll say it in a provocative way, you can hide there. What I call that is atheism of the gaps. We have a gap in our knowledge. Right? We have a gap in our knowledge of the first 10 minus 30 seconds. Everything we do know, both theoretical and experimental, looks like the universe had a beginning, but we don't know. And so if you want to say you're appealing to ignorance in that first 10 minus 30 seconds, I can't disagree. But we often appeal to ignorance when all the data points to something and that tiny little bit we don't know. You can extrapolate a curve and you don't know that the extrapolation is correct, but you're not being inconsistent by extrapolating beyond what you do know.
Can I jump in as a layperson and make sure I understand? So let's just assume someone else is listening that doesn't really know what you guys are saying right now. What I'm hearing is that Brian is saying that there's this infinitesimal but still measurable amount of time from, say, sort of the 0 point to when we can measure back to, right? That we don't know sort of what happened. Like you can measure backwards to this particular time, but there was like a nanosecond before that we don't sort of have in our calculations.
Is that because we can't test it? We can't know about it? Like because of the rules of the universe as it exists now?
Well, I mean, I'll let Dr. Strauss speak.
Well, I would say we don't know. If inflation occurred, we may never be able to experimentally test it. So it depends. Again, we don't know. If you don't know, you can't answer the question.
Okay.
Right.
But my question then for those listening is, and for me,
right?
How does that, what's the problem there?
Well, go ahead, Brian.
My problem isn't so much counting down. It's not the like little bit on the other side of it. It's what's on, before, not really before, if we say time and space come into existence.
Right.
We have to use time language. But
to me, there's a huge range of open questions about this. Like if we could dissolve wind the clock back for the Earth, there's going to be a point where the Earth began, right? And so
maybe.
Oh yeah, sure. Okay, let's say there's a floating orb in space that we wind the clock down, and you ask, when does it exist?
Yeah.
And then you start asking things like, what are the properties of the thing that brought it into existence, and things like that. It seems kind of I don't quite get at God as the answer as I do a bunch of unknowns.
Okay. And again, I think that's a valid criticism, or at least a valid argument. Why do I postulate that God is the answer to time equals 0 when I don't know, rather than something else? So we were talking before we went on the air about the atheist that we both really have a lot of respect for, which is Sean Carroll. And Sean Carroll wrote an article about the beginning of the universe, and he lists 5 possibilities as to the quote cause. One of them was God, which he dismisses immediately. And then he has principle based on just the laws of physics. I don't remember them all, but ultimately his answer is brute force. So Sean Carroll, one of the most brilliant theoretical physicists I know, and he's a fairly good philosopher for a physicist, when he looks at all the options, once dismissing God, his answer is, the best answer is the universe just is. And so that to me is less satisfactory than God. I mean, as a scientist, if I was to say anything just is, the computer I'm looking at just is, you would say, well, you've completely negated all of science, which is causality and natural law. But Sean Carroll looks at all the possibilities of this unknown origin, and he just and all the quantum fluctuations and multiverses and everything. And his best solution is it just is. And I wrote a blog article about it, and I said, Sean Carroll has appealed to deity. He's appealed to, something that just happens to exist. And he wants to say it's the natural world. But if I was to say that about anything else in the natural world, you would say, well, that's not science. And so what I think even someone like Sean Carroll is ultimately saying is the best explanation is something that just is. And since I don't believe in God, it must be nature. And he doesn't see how anti-science that solution is.
Interesting.
It seems like when that is said or when that argument is made, when I listen to these debates with William Lane Craig or something like that, people will say, but you can't take the laws of nature, right, of causality and apply it to the universe. It's a different category. So like the laws of nature don't apply before they exist kind of thing. And so I'm not trying to argue Ryan points for him because I disagree with him, but is it a category error?
That's a really good question.
It makes all the sense in the world to me that if
So
this glass has a beginning, then everything else would.
So what I'd say was we're not talking about these laws of physics. We're talking about causality. Are you willing to throw out causality before in the natural realm, whether it's these laws of physics or something else? Because that's what you're doing.
I'm not.
Well, no, but if the universe is brute force, if it just exists, you've thrown out causality for the universe.
So let me first be really charitable to Sean Carroll. Meaning I don't know what his stance is. I haven't read the paper you're talking about, so I don't know what he said. But I would say, if I had to guess what he would say, is that in dismissing God, what I would think is maybe he's, again, I don't know, maybe he did fully dismiss it, but I would take this approach. I don't dismiss God. I would just say I'm not persuaded by it, but it doesn't help develop a model to, in my understanding of it, it doesn't help me to develop a model. So, and then in getting at the universe just is, I would say something like we ask the question, are we describing the nature of reality? If we describe God just like we describe the universe, right? And we want to ask, why is it that way? Can we map the same attributes and the same reasoning we apply to God to the universe so that we don't get into these like weird tautologies and regressions and all that stuff? Does that make sense?
You said that in kind of our pre-dialogue, and I don't totally understand it. I would say no, you can't. I mean, I think there are aspects of God. I think God would have to be logically possible, for instance. But yeah.
So in using logic to describe God, right? We would say God is logically possible. Would you ever ask, why is God logical? And if so, if you ask, like, is he just is, can we also apply the same response to the universe? Does that make sense?
It does, but I think it's comparing apples and oranges, right? Because you want to ascribe something that is supernatural to a natural universe. I mean, the causality is natural. An uncaused existence is not, you would never accept that as a natural explanation. Now, could it be true? Anything's true, possibly. We could all have been created 5 minutes ago with memories, and there's been no past. But you have to ask what's most likely, what's most probable. And to ascribe a supernatural characteristic of infinite existence to a cause and effect natural world, whether it's these laws or other ones, is to me really begging the question. It's making a leap of faith because I've eliminated the supernatural a priori. You're really ascribing supernatural to the natural, it seems to me, and I may be wrong.
Just to jump in, you said begging the question, so that's circular reasoning, right?
Yeah.
And so you're basically saying that if we can more or less beg the question for nature or for God, because you would say that essentially that's what theists are doing. They're basically saying at the end of it, you posit God, right? I mean, maybe you wouldn't say it like that, but you're saying, what if we did the same for nature? Just to clarify for my own mind and for listeners.
Sure.
So, but Dr. Strauss is saying they're different categories because nature falls in the natural category and God falls in the supernatural category. And so it comes back to this idea, and Sarah and I were talking about this the other day, that like God doesn't really belong in a conversation where the accusation, not that you're making, but the accusation is circular reasoning. Because if God is who he is, as the ground of all being, or as the reason for all existence, like that is a virtuous circle. You know, like that's acceptable, and that premise is fine. It holds together. It's not small circular reasoning. It's the result of God being who God is. You know what I mean? Whereas nature wouldn't fit into that same.
I would say that it's not, either one of our positions is not circular. What I would
agree
say
with that.
with either position, you get to kind of, we'll use a term by a philosopher. He's not the first to coin it, but he's someone I've been reading recently, Graham Oppy. He says, you know, either way, you're going to get to these brute ideas about the universe. Just call them brute facts or whatever you want to call them. And if you get to that idea about God, right, and you get to them about the universe, you can map certain ideas. And I think what you're saying is one is supernatural and one is natural. So to expect the nature of the natural to behave like the supernatural is just, I'm making that error.
Well, what I would say is you're postulating supernatural. You don't call it.
This is so exciting.
You don't call it that because you don't want to, but you really are. In fact, Gerald Schroeder, who is a Jewish physicist who's written a lot about the origin, he's got a great quote which I won't remember, but it has to do with Sean Carroll or someone who's done the same thing, and he lists the characteristics of what's required for this creation of the universe that's natural, and he says, sounds a lot like God to me.
So what should I call supernatural? What should I define as supernatural?
Well, again, that's a great question, because, you know, you could define it as outside of this universe, but if there's multiverses, I would say that's still, you know, natural. So it's a great question. Let me see if I even have a succinct answer. I mean, in the context of this conversation, we're talking about a self-existent eternal being, or let's change the word, a self-existent eternal entity. That to me is supernatural in this context. Now, again, you might say, well, it's okay for nature to be a self-existing eternal entity, and I would say, is it? Can I say that about anything within nature? Well, you'd say no, but you want to then extend it to nature itself. That to me seems, I don't know, it just seems kind of crazy.
Brian, is one of the problems that you're having, and again, I'm just trying to understand this, not just for myself, but for other people listening that are on my level, which is lower than y'all's, on this topic. Are you saying that to use any kind of terminology that would be defined as being sort of outside the laws of physics or logic or those sorts of things, then we're already within the kind of tautology of working within those things, and that's our problem? Like, to say that God is outside the laws of nature means the laws of nature sort of were at their disposal? I mean, is that the problem?
I mean, that's interesting.
Brian's so nice.
The point I was going to,
he's like, no, you're wrong, but I'll say it's interesting.
Let me lay it all out on the table, just so you know, and maybe I can even move this along.
Yeah.
But so let's say there is a supernatural world and we have a natural world, and we make a really good distinction between the two. In my understanding, there would be some cause, like some, not a physical causal order, but some order that would what's the trans word? Transcend through the two types of realities, right? But either way, right, they're reality. Both are, right? So when I talk about the natural, all I mean is just reality. And I get some people want to make a distinction, and this is where we'll, vastly diverge in our understanding of the world. But I guess I would ask, why can't we extend that order outward to God? And then is it purely, in your view, like an experimental roadblock that we can't get to God experimentally, but we can through like physical theory, or not, I guess, beyond metaphysical theory? Or...
So I guess I don't know that I totally understand your question or objection, but I guess I would first answer it like this. I don't have a problem with what you're saying, but it's not the God described in the Bible. And so is there a deity that you want to make pantheism, in some sense, a pantheistic God? Well, there is such an idea of God. And that's what I would say you're describing, some kind of pantheistic God. But that's not the God of the Bible, is what I would argue.
Gotcha. Well, let me just move this along then and ask, why can't I think of the universe as being eternal?
You can, but
Okay.
But again, I would.
But it'd be silly.
Well, no, I would say, do you really think that within, that there is an uncaused cause, that I can keep going back in a series of events, and eventually I come to the point where there's an uncaused cause that's no different than what we have now, where if I said anything we have now is an uncaused cause, you'd think I'm crazy. You just want to extend this back far enough so you can't see it anymore, and then say, well, that's the uncaused cause. But if I was to walk back to that time and say, this computer is it, it's the beginning of everything, it's the uncaused cause, you'd say that's crazy.
But Brian, you're saying, what if it was eternal and there is no cause? It always has been, right? In this sort of experiment, thought experiment.
Right. So that's what I agree. That's what he's saying. Maybe I'm not. Yeah. But again, you have to get there through natural events, a sequence of natural events that gets there and says, okay, at this point, it's always been. But where is that? Is that, 5 minutes ago? You'd say I'm crazy. Is it 14 billion years ago? You'd say I'm crazy.
So this is where I can't help but get a little bit philosophical. So when we're talking about, you're talking about a chain of events, right? And going back, and we want to see how far. In my view, I would say something like the chain of events are part of a set, and the set trying to think of how to say this like you can pick a point on a timeline and move one increment in any direction that you want and on that timeline, right? But let's go back to where we say space and time began, right? Do we have to accept that space and time began there? Because once I start doing that, I have problems with understanding reality itself. Because I think of things existing in a space, and I think of things doing things. So I guess on your view, do you take there being like this, I was going to say outer space, but like a transcendent space that's where God exists or is?
Yeah. So you bring up a great question and a great point, right?
Y'all are so friendly.
What does it mean to be? I can't imagine no space and time.
Right.
I love the book Flatland, even though it's not a great written book, because it gives me an idea of how limited one is to their dimensions they exist in. and how, the Flatland book is about a universe that's two-dimensional, and the two-dimensional being can't even understand a three-dimensional being. So I, as a maybe four-dimensional being, if you want to count space and time, cannot even begin to understand or fathom what it is beyond that. So, when we use terms like beginning of space and time, we really don't know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So let's see. So what was
your with you?
Yeah. So what was so what I will say again, if I was sitting in your chair making your argument, I could say I can have an infinite timeline that goes back infinitely, and I can still see a sequence of events going back that never ends. I can pick any point. We can start 14 billion years ago when the universe was created, this universe, who knows how many there were before it. And I can go back and I can just say, I can never get back to that infinite timeline because it is infinite. And I would say a couple things. First of all, we don't even know if there really are any physical infinities. The reason people don't believe that there's a quantum theory of gravity is because we have infinities. The reason people think that, we don't know what's at the center of a black hole is because we have infinities. Whenever we reach an infinity in physics, we say it's because we don't understand it. But now you want an infinitely long timeline, and that's still natural? Again, to me, it goes back to this. It just seems inconsistent with your worldview to pose an eternally infinite universe in a natural world, a set of cause and effect physical laws, even if it's different physical laws than what we have. Because everything on that timeline has been cause and effect, and you just want it to extend infinitely back.
So for one, I would agree, I don't know what time is, and I think most scientists and philosophers would probably agree that nobody knows. There's a great quote. It's like, when I forget how it goes, but it's like, when I think about time or I write about it, I know how to describe it, but when someone asks me what time is, I have no idea.
Yeah.
I forget who. It's a terrible paraphrase, but I would say, the issues, I can either get really complicated and philosophical and go into we're talking about infinite sets and not numbers, and we're talking about a string of events and all this stuff, or I can just say, which I'm gonna do for the sake of this, it doesn't seem like an issue to think of it eternally, just like I could think of God eternally, especially if there is a beginning of, when we talk about the space-time universe, right? We talking about within this kind of a bubble, I guess, not from a point, but that is a point or something like that. How I guess, maybe get me, if you can, where we start to infer God, I guess. And that can,
Right.
This can go towards fine tuning or
Right. So first of all, let's take a step back, because we're kind of moving to a different subject, and I think we should. We've been on this one long enough. I think what we both would say is that it's almost back to Sean Carroll with brute force. There's something that just exists. And I would argue that to say anything natural made of physical laws, to argue it just exists, is being inconsistent with a naturalistic worldview. Therefore, you're postulating supernatural. And you would just say, no, you don't see that.
I guess I don't understand why it would go against.
Right, because to me, there's natural infers cause and effect. It infers physical laws that exist. And now you're postulating brute force eternity. And that to me is inconsistent with the worldview of naturalism.
When you say cause, do you mean this world, I would agree with you that we have the physical world that is everything has a physical cause, right, in our existence. But I think there's another way to think about cause, and that's in terms of explanation and things like that. And that, I think, could get someone like me out of that. There are explanations, but there's also room to not know, and to kind of ponder weird situations and things like that. And to me, all that means is that the theist is willing to postulate and grab on a little step further and go, I believe in God. Like, he's reached out to us and he's revealed himself to us. So what I want to know is, how do I make that extra step, right?
Yeah, so I like that. Let's move on. So what I would say is the reason I'm not just a theist, but a Christian, there is no single silver bullet. There is no single argument. I think the cosmological argument is a good scientific argument. I think fine-tuning is a good scientific argument. But there's more, right? There's the historical supposed event of the resurrection of Jesus. There are sociological arguments. There's the nature of man arguments, or humans. I don't want to be sexist. There's, there's worldview arguments. There's philosophical and ontological arguments. And if I was a lawyer making a case for God, I wouldn't just say, the cosmological argument, as Sarah said, it ties everything up in a bow. Nothing ties everything up in a bow. Life's too messy for that. Mm-hmm. But I would make a case based on, how do you explain that even when people are educated, they still are unkind to others? What's your solution to the human problem? How do you explain the first century church that was based on the belief that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead? How do you explain, and when I begin to build a full case, it's that leads me to be a Christian, not any single one thing.
One of the things you said made me think of one of the questions that Brian put in his, I asked him ahead of time to send some questions that he might want to ask you, and you've seen those. First, I just have to remark how this is just so funny. You guys are so friendly. Brian will say something and I'm over here thinking, I have no idea what he means. And then you say, yes, that's a great question. And you answer it. It's funny. I hope that our listeners are following along where I am lost. But so Brian supplied.
But you use the word tautology and I just go, wow, she's really good.
Well, I learned that just for today. No, I'm kidding. No, I'm a mom. I have to know what a tautology is. So when my kids do it, I have to bust them, No, I asked Brian to write up like 5 or 6 questions, and he did, and they're all about physics except one of them. And that's where I want to point us just for a couple of minutes, because I think if anyone's listening that's like, I can't handle talking about the universe and space-time anymore, then maybe this will be a little break for you. You mentioned something about that Brian has to answer questions the same way that we do about some of these things that we see in the world. Namely, the one I'm going to ask about is suffering. One of the questions that he put in there was, what does Dr. Strauss think about suffering? What's his solution to the problem of suffering? And I think you're going to probably ask the same question of Brian, but I'm curious I realize this is not the top question you get asked as a physicist, but surely you have thoughts on it nonetheless. I'm curious what they are.
It's the top question I ask about life, maybe, right?
Yeah.
Because
most of us.
So I think when I thought about that, and it was actually phrased in a different way than I often hear it. I often hear, what do you think about the problem of evil rather than the problem of suffering? And I think they're a distinction, right? If I have a pain, I would call that suffering, but the pain might actually be good because it points a problem that I have. My brother died of pancreatic cancer. Why do people die of pancreatic cancer? Because there are no symptoms. There is no suffering until it's way too late. And so I think, is it really the problem of suffering, or is it the problem of evil? And things that we may think of as suffering, right? I mean, I don't know anything about leprosy, but I've heard leprosy is really a disease where you don't feel pain anymore. And so, you deteriorate by scratching yourself and all this because you don't suffer from pain. And so I think we have to be careful as humans that sometimes what we think of as suffering may actually, we even see at times it's good for us. So suffering for you may be a positive thing for me. I played football and the mantra was pain is good when you're playing football, because if not, then you're not going to, survive very long. And so it's easier as a Christian to answer the questions. I mean, this is not an easy question, period, but to discuss the problem of evil than the problem of suffering, because I'm not even sure I know how to define suffering in a way that's consistent with pain that can be good, for instance.
it's interesting because the same conference where I listened to you, I listened to somebody else, and he basically built a whole case about seemingly purposeless suffering, which I think is what most people mean when they ask about suffering. They don't mean, why was I sad when my boyfriend broke up with me? Oh, and then you found out later you married someone better. And oh, that wasn't really suffering. It was really just a step along the road, or, this kind of thing about you touch something hot, it hurts to protect us from touching something hot again, whatever. But the seemingly purposeless suffering, like children dying, human trafficking, terrorism, these kinds of, people being victims, I think.
So is that, again, I would ask, is that really suffering or is it evil? Maybe it's just semantics and it doesn't matter, but we can talk about, again, it's a tough question regardless.
Yeah.
And the first thing I would say as a Christian is that the God described in the Bible weeps over suffering. The God described in the Bible is a compassionate God who his heart breaks when he sees suffering. Now, then you can ask the question, well, the age-old question, well, how would a good God allow suffering?
Right. Why doesn't he do something about it?
Right. Well, and again, there are answers. I think the answers in the Christian worldview, to me, are the most satisfying. You can make a philosophical argument that without a divine lawgiver, there is no consistent definition of evil. There is no real definition of evil. I know it's debated, and we're not saying that atheists are not good or evil people. What we're saying is that I don't think you can make a philosophical definition of evil because it always becomes subjective. It will always be a subjective definition without some divine standard. And so, to me, the problem of evil is hard enough, but the Christian answer, which to me is most satisfying, is a fewfold. One is that God is compassionate and weeps over suffering. His heart breaks as much for, the woman in Afghanistan who's had all her rights taken away as my heart breaks. And then the second thing is, it's not that God hasn't done anything about it. It's that the fulfillment of what God has done about it hasn't been completed yet. And I think it's the yet that is so crucial. The Christian worldview says God cares so much about evil and suffering that he sent his son to take care of it. A huge sacrifice. I have 2 kids. I would not sacrifice them for somebody who told me, who gave me the finger or whatever. And that's according to the Bible, what God did. And that ultimately this problem will be taken care of completely. And so to me, if I'm an atheist, I can't even really philosophically argue that the Holocaust wasn't evil. But if I'm a Christian, I can say not only does the Christian God weep at the Holocaust, but he's ultimately solved the problem. That to me is so much more fulfilling.
And I would go back to the question of purpose, calling it purposeless. Like, we're not in a position to know whether it's purposeless or not. So to say, for example, the child with leukemia, right? You could just as easily extrapolate that as like with the boyfriend to say, yes, but a certain number of children had to have that leukemia to be able to find the cure so that all future children would not have that leukemia. Like you could even take something that we would call purposeless now, but with the perspective of time, we would say, oh, well, actually, now we realize that it wasn't purposeless at all. So can I just go back bigger, like big picture kind of question?
Yeah,
too?
but eventually I do want to hear Brian come back on this.
Okay.
But yeah.
Well, no, why don't you do that while we're on it?
Sure.
If you'd like. Not to put you on the spot.
Let's put him on the spot.
I think I can at least think of 2 approaches in coming to this. And I think we all take this approach. And we, for one, we all think about this problem. Like we want to know why, even if I don't know how, but if we didn't have the idea of God in our head, we'd want to know how to stop suffering, or at least for our part. But I think we approach this typically in a way that either we look at suffering as if we did it, and then we look at suffering through what we would do if we were God. And so I think when we look at it like that, we come across these weird scenarios. And I think theology has Christianity is 2,000 years old. They've responded to this. So I don't want you to think I'm naively saying this or anything, but I think when we think about God, we think about something who created the universe and is very powerful and has the ability to do things that we could even call unimaginable. So the question I come across when I do that is, I would stop the things that I think are bad. Would other people think they're bad? Maybe not. But I think that we don't really get to a solution to the problem than we do kind of a take on the problem from two different perspectives. But in my perspective, we want suffering to stop, and we have the opportunity to try and stop suffering. So we do that, or let's say non-beneficial suffering. Let's call it that. Beneficial is also very relative. Let's say we can narrow this down and get really philosophical. We'll call it evil. What we define as evil is and I'm trying to describe it. I'm not not trying to define evil, but to describe how the world works. When people mark something as evil, they see it as something that needs to be stopped, right? Regardless of what it is. And so we try and stop it. We are often mistaken, and we're often we do a terrible job at trying to stop things sometimes. So we have unintended evil and things like that. But I don't think that, to me, it doesn't solve any problems to have a God and then still have evil. To me, the problem would be solved if you had the benefits from suffering without the suffering. Like if you could instill those without like a poor woman being burned from head to toe or something like that, it's or a poor man, either way, not trying to be sexist or anything.
Burning is bad.
Burning is terrible. And that's, I think we also live in America, so it's hard to see it. But if you walk into hospitals and you go to certain areas of town, there is suffering that I wouldn't wish on enemies. And it's terrible. And that's where I kind of get lost in the theological debate. And I start saying, let's fix the problem rather than discuss the theological impacts. So that's my...
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. Again, one of my favorite verses in scripture is Isaiah 55 that says, God's ways are not man's ways, for as high as the heavens are above the earth, so are God's ways above man's ways. Well, how high are the heavens above the earth? At least 35 billion light years away. So what it's saying to me is the writer could have given any analogy of God being different than man. And the analogy he gives is the farthest distance imaginable in this universe. And so, again, I don't understand why God doesn't stop in and fix it now. That's what you and I would do, we think, if we were God. But what I do know is that I'm not God, and he will step in and fix it. I mean, let's say you see your kids arguing, and maybe you want to let them argue for a while, and I mean, you don't. It's a bad analogy because no one's getting hurt. As soon as you get hurt, you step in. But I can't tell you for certain. I can speculate why there's this waiting period, but again, the biblical God cares so much that he paid the ultimate sacrifice to solve the problem ultimately. Why it's not solved now, I can give you theological answers.
Yeah.
But I can't give you emotionally satisfying answers.
Well, and I think there's also a little bit of a false dichotomy that I heard. Maybe you didn't intend it this way, but in describing, you say, well, I would stop it. But then you ended by saying, so we could stop it, or we can kind of discuss it theologically. And I think both those things can happen at once, right? Like people, atheists and Christians alike, can fight some of the worst suffering in the world while we wait for God to do what he's going to do or not.
Well, we're called to do that, right? As Christians. In fact, many of the philanthropic organizations in the world were started by Christians. The vast majority of them were started by Christians because of this calling to be God's hands and feet while we're here on earth.
Yeah. But Evan, what were you going to ask about before?
Well, it kind of ties into a previous podcast we did, because you brought up the
With J. Warner Wallace?
yeah,
That one?
Yeah, because
sorry, I was very excited about that podcast.
And it was very good. And so there's this image again of like the jury. You mentioned that the jury, Dr. Strauss, and kind of the all the arguments you would marshal. But I would posit, I think that assumes reasonable jurors, right? Or
when he said if he was a lawyer, yeah.
Or in the spiritual sense, jurors whose hearts are open to receiving right? And so I think that part of the like if Brian and I were to have a long enough time to talk and visit and maybe a beer or something,
let's do it sometime.
Yeah. So the question, like, I used to think the question was people didn't know the arguments.
Mm-hmm.
But they know the arguments. But like if you have a juror who gets, this is why we have the voir dire process, right? You're trying to knock out the jurors whose mind is closed to the possibility that this person did it, that they deserve the death penalty, et cetera, et cetera. And so, but when a Christian is making arguments to unbelievers, right? You don't have that. You might just be stuck with the juror who's like, it doesn't matter what you say, right? Like you could give me 1,000 arguments and like, I'm still, because I'm committed to God, not believe. And so that would be the first thing that I would want to know from Brian or anyone else, like, is it possible that God exists? Like, are you actually really open to that possibility? Because at some point, like at some point in this conversation, the word I'm going to have to come to with you is it's one of repentance. Like it's okay. And it's not that I'm a better person than you. In fact, morally, you're probably a far greater person than me, blah, 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 blah. But
we'll compare notes later on which one's better. Yeah.
But I think when you look at the preaching of the apostles and John the Baptist and Jesus, like that's part of the preaching process and the evangelism process that maybe some apologists don't like.
Yeah.
Because we kind of want to keep it all.
What do you mean when you say repent? Because I think people think of like the Baptist pastor on the street corner with the megaphone.
So it's not just changing your moral behavior, although that's part of it. It's right. It's changing of mind. That's what the word means. It's changing your mind. And I think, a sincere openness to the things that we're going to be talking about. And so
when you say repentance, you mean and like opening yourself up to the possibility that you could be wrong and there could be something.
You admit the possibility that you could be wrong.
Yeah.
Right. Because if the juror is sitting there again saying it doesn't matter what evidence you bring, like in the example I give is like the OJ jury. Okay. Like there were people in that jury that were, it would not, the evidence would not have mattered. And they have said that.
Yeah.
They have admitted this,
Yeah.
So that's where I think the jury argument, it's a good argument, but
so when it comes to spiritual matters, there's something extra to take into.
Let me add something too. I think this is a good word for Christians too. There, we supposedly serve a God of truth. Mm-hmm. And if so, then ultimately all truth should point to this God, whether it's truth in science, like I said, or philosophy or sociology. And I know Christians who are not open to exploring the truth about areas of science or whatever. And to me, that's a shame, because if the God I serve is a God of truth, then ultimately all truth's going to lead to him. And I think we as Christians on the jury need to say, we're willing also to take the evidence where it leads. Some people say to me, you Christianity or what you believe is unfalsifiable, which is a scientific term. I say it's totally falsifiable. If you find the bones of Jesus, then I'm stupid to believe I'm a Christian, and I will give it up, because I don't believe it because it does something for me. I believe it because I think it's true. And it's totally falsifiable because it's based on this historical event. And there are other things that I know because they tell me Christians believe that I think are totally false. And we as Christians need to be willing to look at the evidence and follow it where it goes as well.
Yeah, for sure. We are essentially out of time. And I mean, I know we only scratched the surface, and I feel like I can feel the we didn't get to coming from all around me, but we only have an hour. So how about this? Are there any kind of just like a final thought or a final question that either of you have that you wanted to make sure got onto the podcast today?
Yes.
Okay.
Mike, I just want to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to dialogue with you. It's an awesome opportunity, and I really appreciate it. This is coming from an undergraduate. I'm in grad school right now, so
what are you studying? What are you
Physics
studying?
and also for the money, data science.
Right.
It's a hot
But,
word
you
right
know,
now.
a lot of the physics we discuss, I'm a particle physicist. Cosmology is related, but it's very different, right? And I'm not a theoretical physicist. I'm experimental physicist. You know the joke that the more education you get, you learn more and more about less and less. So when you get a PhD, you know everything about nothing.
Oh my gosh, that's
And
amazing.
there's some truth to that. And so, you know, I was going to, when Sarah gave us the opportunity, that's exactly what I was going to say to you, Brian, is I appreciate the opportunity, the dialogue. And there are many things we didn't even touch on, including fine tuning and the arguments against that. So maybe, you know, sometime in the future, we can get back together and
Maybe
dialogue on some of these other things as well.
Would you be interested in maybe like a follow-up one in the future? Well, whenever, but maybe we do an email dialogue in between. I think that might help move the conversation to a better.
Yeah.
I'm going to let you guys make your date off the air.
Okay.
But have your bro physicist nerd.
I want to come
date.
down to Houston and have the beer while we're doing this.
Oh, yes, let's do that. And I'll just sit on the sidelines and watch and do this and be confused, and it'll be great. Maybe if I drink enough beer, it'll all make sense to me. Yeah. But thank you so much for coming on, and thank you for coming on. And well, you have to. But thank you all for listening. Again, review the podcast and tell your friends about it. If you want to reach any of these guys, Dr. Strauss, how could people reach you if they want to ask more questions or learn more about your books or those sorts of things?
I have a blog, www.michaelgstrauss.com, and there's an email link there. So just send it through that.
What was the middle initial again?
G, Michael G. Strauss. There is a very well-known astrophysicist at Princeton who is Michael A. Strauss.
Oh, how funny.
So we have actually met, and occasionally I will get emails that say, or he'll get emails that say, I saw you on YouTube talking about Christianity and science, and he's Jewish. So he'll send it to me and say, I think this one's for you. And we've actually
that's
met.
cute.
So,
no, I
so
love
therefore, everything has to have my middle initial as well.
Okay. I got it. And Brian, if people want to tell you why you're wrong, no, I'm kidding. But if they want to chat with you about this, how can people find you?
Right now, you can find me on Facebook. Just search Brian Woods. You can also email me at thisisbrianwoods, Brian with an I, at gmail.com. This is Brian Woods. Ta-da! And everything you need to know about Theology on Tap and Theology on Air, you can find at HoustonTOT.com. And until we see you again, we encourage you, as always, to question freely, think deeply, and disagree as needed.